To fight real monsters, we don't need toxic empathy or notions like exorcisms can resolve all demonic problems. Instead, we as Christians start with the gospel of Jesus Christ that alone brings holiness. Yet how do we also train our imaginations with better stories to help us battle the beasts? Geoffrey Reiter, who is a writer, returns to our studio to explore how great literature reflects God's grace and helps us defeat the darkness.
Speculative fiction, like no other genre, reflects the creativity of God.
If you look at the scriptures, you're going to have to see that God uses imagination more than rational discourse.
We are supposed to be image bearers for a vastly creative God.
Reading fantastical fiction opened a portal in my imagination for a place other than just a materialistic world.
I experienced the gospel story with the mind of someone who loved adventure and loved the idea of light conquering darkness.
We're wired for stories that reflect how we see the world in ways that are true.
The story is either pointing to Christ or it's pointing to our need for Christ.
Enter freely into the Lorehaven studio for Fantastical Truth, this podcast from Lorehaven.com that helps you explore fantastical stories for God's glory. I'm me, Stephen Burnett. I published Lorehaven. I'm also the author of a sci-fi novel that launched earlier this year from Enclave Publishing called Above the Circle of Earth, about space missionaries fighting a different kind of monster beyond the Earth.
And I'm Zackary Russell, and lately I've been wondering, when does a man become a monster? And if you got that reference, you're a musical theater nerd, and this is episode 287. How do great stories help us defeat monsters?
Zach, I'm curious what monsters, obviously metaphorical monsters, you have fought this week. I, for instance, the previous day, was fighting a strange sense of fatigue and something akin to writer's block. Now that I'm a professional writer, I thought that wasn't allowed. I've got deadlines. I'm doing this for money now, as well as for heart motives and mission and all of that good stuff. I'm not allowed to have writer's block, but there it was, a block monster trying to smash me.
My main monster I'm fighting right now is still my PCL injury in my right leg, and going to physical therapy and getting tortured there. So you could say my physical therapist is my monster now. I'm just kidding. She's very much helping me get better, but it's not a fun process of having all kinds of things rebuilt in your leg, little by little, stretch by stretch. I'm really just kind of battling myself because I just can't do a whole lot. I can't walk up the steps right now. I can't walk very far or very fast. A lot of other things are painful or awkward. It feels like a monster has taken over my body.
Well, Zach, sometimes like the Spider-Man 3 poster said in 2007, the greatest battle lies within. And Geoffrey will appreciate this reference when he hears it. There's a Deep Space Nine episode where a bunch of the good guys and a bunch of different alien allies are imprisoned in a Dominion on a Dominion-owned asteroid. And then one of them has to creep into the small claustrophobic space and fight his own claustrophobia. And do Worf and General Martok make fun of him for being weak in regard to claustrophobia? No, they say to each other, that man has the strength of will to face his own fears. And that's how Klingons think about the greatest battle lying within and the monsters that we fight, sometimes where folks can't even see. Of course, it's over with Monster Month, aren't we? Because we finished the whole spooky season just a few days ago. And actually, as we record, we are still celebrating All Saints Day, November 1st, which is why Halloween is all heathen and pagan and tries to crowd out All Saints Day, but not really. Nevertheless, one thing we love about Christian saints and heroes is that they fought different kinds of monsters, which require different kinds of tools. So that's what we'll be exploring as soon as Geoffrey gets here. One of those tools is Christian-made fantastical novels, which we celebrate at Lorehaven with weekly reviews, such as our recent review of the fantasy Lord of Winter. Lord willing, we will also get a review this coming week for another book called Picked Up Pieces. How do you get those reviews? Go to Lorehaven.com and also support this mission by subscribing free. We'll get you updates in your email box, as well as the exclusive access code to the Lorehaven Guild, our server on Discord, our castle in the cloud. By the way, we've got a new novel coming up from our sponsor today, which is from Enclave Publishing, the top sponsor. and it is the long-awaited sequel to Maxine Justice Galactic Attorney, another standalone in this universe called Maxine Justice Public Offender. The case she didn't need, the client she didn't want, the trial she couldn't win. Fresh off her single-handed defense against alien adversaries in a galactic courtroom, Maxine Justice discovers that saving the Earth is not enough to earn a hero's welcome back home. Once again broke and now looking for revenge, her return to Night Court as a public defender takes an immediate detour when she's tasked with defending a theropod murder suspect. The case drags her into the quirky theories of her new client, Father Gilbert Barthez, and the corrupt underbelly of corporate robotics. As her defense takes on global significance, Maxine lands squarely in the crosshairs of new enemies determined to conceal their plans for acquiring the planet. Worse, her probably guilty client may be the only one who can expose what's really happening. Stripped of all credibility and most of her friends, can Maxine find some way to save humanity when the world is bent on self-destruction, or will Earth finally succumb to the most unlikely deception? Enclave Publishing presents Maxine Justice Public Offender, just released today, November 4th, and available wherever these books are sold. You can ask for it at your local library or go to enclavepublishingstore.com for 20% off. It's also on Amazon, and it's in digital hardcover and audiobook. Maxine Justice Public Offender. See lorehaven.com/podcast for more details. From there, a portal just opened, possibly leading to a cosmic abysmal dimension. Let's get that thing closed real fast, but not before we get our guest through it, Geoffrey Reiter. Geoffrey Reiter, glad you made it back from said cosmic abysmal dimension, crawling through. I hope you didn't get pieces of the other dimension stuck to you or whatever shifted radiation is clinging on. What were you doing in there anyway?
I was facing the depths of cosmic despair, and I am crawling my way out now, and that is kind of, I think, what we do for Christian horror writers like I am. Look at the monster, look at the beast, and crawl our way back out again, with not on our own strength, though, with the Lord's strength.
Amen. Now, Geoffrey, I'm going to channel my inner church lady, except channeling is of the new age, and say that we ought not have anything to do with such fruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them, as the Apostle Paul wrote. So that's what you do in this business of horror/paranormal writing and weird fiction. You've not only made weird fiction with this new book, The Lime Kiln and Other Enchanted Spaces, but you're also a scholar of weird fiction, and you have published academic articles on Lovecraft and Arthur Machen and Bram Stoker and Clark Ashton Smith, and you've been in a bunch of other publications. And you're also faithfully an associate editor at Christ and Pop Culture, my old stomping grounds, where my last article was about Godzilla, King of the Monsters. So tell us a little bit about The Lime Kiln and Other Enchanted Spaces. It's a short story collection, but just a little bit, too, about your origin story as a biblical Christian and a fan of weird stories like this.
My origin as a biblical Christian came at a very young age. I'm a pastor's kid, and my mom was a missionary's kid, so I go way back on those fronts. My father was always somebody who I would always say he was always going to be either a really pastoral academic or a really academic pastor. And because the church I was growing up in didn't have any office because they met in like middle schools and stuff like that, my dad's office was home. And so I grew up with like books everywhere, like all over the place. At this point now, my parents' place is basically like every room is my dad's office. So there's books all over the place. So reading was always a big part of that. And we read, some of the usual suspects, like Narnia, for example. I remember George MacDonald pretty young as well. So I was always interested in speculative fiction. I think I got interested in sort of the horror side of that very gradually, maybe through middle and high school. I think probably I was more of a science fiction guy in middle and high school, but I read some horror here and there. And it was really more, I think, in college that I started to read extensively in those. A lot of Bram Stoker, as you know. I am a Stoker fan. Dracula and several of his other books as well. I read on my own time in college. And I first got into Lovecraft at that time. And I think that Lovecraft I actually had heard about earlier and was interested in. And he's probably the most famous of this so-called weird fiction genre, subgenre, along with maybe Poe. if you ever looked at the old 1980s and 90s editions of Lovecraft stuff, they always had these like really, really kind of gory, lurid covers. And so I never really bought any of them because I was assuming my parents would not approve, which ironically was almost certainly not the case. Like, I think they would have been fine with it, but I finally started reading some Lovecraft and some other similar writers like that in college and got really into them. And it's funny because almost every place I've been to, at least in terms of like my professional or academic life, I always assumed that the church lady position would be the thing I was like encountering, that people would be like, oh, Christians and horror, like that's a problem, isn't it? And what I found is that almost in all of the places, everybody made the same assumption I did, that somebody else would have a problem with it, but like none of them actually did.
That's so funny how that happens. It kind of this imaginary monsters that we're all making up about each other. And then we take a look in a room with some honesty happening and realize, hold on a second, you don't have a problem with that? I thought you'd have a problem with that. Well, I thought you'd have a problem with that. And then suddenly, oh, well, what do you know? We don't have a problem with it. And it's not because we're libertines. It's because we're maybe a little more thoughtful Christians about this.
That would be the idea. So yeah, it was funny. My undergrad English major that I was at, one of my professors wrote vampire stories. And then I went to seminary and I did a master's thesis in church history on Lovecraft and Puritans. And then I did my PhD in English and wrote it on Arthur Machen, who is another horror author. And then I went to the Baptist College of Florida, now the Baptist University of Florida, and I taught horror writers there as well. And then I was pretty upfront when I came to my current place, Lancaster Bible College, that like, this is who I am. Like, you can take me or not, but like, this is what I do. They actually asked me in the interview, like, what would be your dream course? What would you love to teach? And I was like, hey, I'd teach a weird fiction course if you let me, which I actually do now. So I will, for the second time next semester, be teaching my course, Strange Gods, Religion, and the Weird Horror Tradition. So kind of every place that I've been to, I'm not saying I haven't encountered individuals who might have objections, but I have not really encountered broad opposition. And, many of my fellow churchgoers at the Mennonite church I am a member of now have bought my book and are reading it as well. So, it's... It reminds me a little bit of some things if you read a lot of Chesterton, which I do, that oftentimes in Chesterton's books, a lot of people who spend most of the story or the book thinking that they're enemies find themselves all together and realize that they've been on the same side the whole time. Now, I don't think that people who object to horror are my enemies, but like the idea is like, maybe there's actually some commonality we have that we weren't even realizing.
Geoffrey, that is so wholesome, and it serves to illustrate a truth I've noticed, is that you actually can get pretty far. I mean, not to say the world is not full of monsters, it is, but you actually can get pretty far as a Christian, even if you're into weird fiction, so long as you're not sinning. If you are clear to people that you are just as interested in the gospel and holiness and applying biblical truth in a corrupt world like anybody else, and you're not going out there going, like a bratty teenager saying, hey, I like weird fiction. I like wearing t-shirts with skulls on them. What are you going to do about it? I think most rational people can pick up on the idea, oh, this guy is actually a wholesome Christ-like dude who has this like interesting interest, but I like this guy, so maybe the thing that I thought was evil is actually good. And then you're following that wisdom of the Apostle Paul, who tells people, don't let what you regard as good be called evil. And I say that a lot when it comes to this broader discussion about horror fiction and paranormal and such. You can get pretty far in those discussions just by not being defensive. And if someone is going to engage with you in bad faith, or more likely they don't engage with you at all, well then, okay, you can move on or ignore that person and you give them a nice little church lady, bless his heart, and then go back to your weird fiction.
Yeah, and to you, our listener, if this is your first time to hear us talk about horror and spooky stories, this is kind of part of a mini series that we've done. We have a lot of episodes about this, so you can find this episode page or just look for our Monster Month series. We have a playlist for that on YouTube. But, you may also be wondering, why are we talking about this in November? Like, we're already past Halloween. We're recording this the day after Halloween. And, Stephen, I came across this quote this morning. This is from a guy on X named Owen Cyclops. And he says, much as the moderns observe Christmas as an isolated event and then it's over, whereas traditionally Christmas was a start and proceeded for 12 days, clearly Halloween is the start of a spooky time that then continues. November has a dark edge not present in playful October. I read that this morning. I thought, is that really true? And then, because people take their decorations down most of the time. Some people are leaving those giant 20-foot skeletons up all year round now. But I think it's true because I don't watch a lot of horror, read a lot of horror, but when I do, it's usually around this time. And what I find is that during October, I'm like, oh, I'll put that on my playlist. Sure, I'll watch that later. And then I usually get to it in November for some reason. I don't know why that is. But he's right in that Halloween is really just a playful time for the most part. For my kids love to dress up just for fun and for candy and for meeting neighbors. Like we just met 6 new neighbors last night, and now we have this big group text, which is fun. But there is something about this season kind of continuing on, and there's sort of this edge to it, like you said. So I'm really just observing that. I have some more to say about that when we get to chapter 2 a little bit. But do you find that to be true, Geoffrey, that there is a certain season of the year where you're more interested in these stories, or is it kind of year round with you?
I think there is some element of that. And certainly as far as if you're a horror writer trying to do self-promotion, October and a little into November is a handy season. I find that it makes some kind of sense, especially if we kind of zoom out a little bit. So if we see All Hallows Eve, for instance, as leading into All Saints Day, we've got this darker period that then leads to this glimmer of light, of this recognition of God's holy people throughout history that we can celebrate, which is the day that we're recording this. And it sort of parallels and I think feeds into nicely then kind of the next cycle of liturgical time, which is Advent leading into Christmas, so that we get this period of yearning and mourning and longing as the days grow darker and darker. And then you've got this flash of celebration with the Christmas season. And then as things start to get even brighter, then, you would even potentially move even further into Epiphany and the revelation of Christ to the nations and to Israel as well. And so I think that it's actually situated pretty well there. Now, as far as my own reading, that's often kind of, I always read at least one. I read a lot of things at once, usually like a dozen books at once, and I have different categories. So I usually have one speculative book that I'm reading at any given moment that varies between science fiction, fantasy, or horror, depending on which one I'm going for. I do try, even for myself, I try not to read too much horror, especially of certain kinds, all at once. I'll often kind of oscillate between different ones, just because for my own personal mental and spiritual health, just to make sure that I'm not overdoing it. I don't really find myself really troubled in bad spiritual ways. I think there's good ways to be troubled by good literature, but I don't find myself mentally or spiritually troubled, having nightmares or getting broody into dark, goth ways, just by being exposed to horror. But I also don't want that to happen. And I know other people, your mileage may vary, right? Some other people can only take sort of small doses of it at a given time. So I don't know that mine's quite as always so seasonal, although it'd be interesting for me to step back. I've never tried step back and map out what books I was reading at any given moment.
Well, maybe around February or something, Geoffrey, you can try some of these romantasy books, these whimsical castles and kingdoms and princesses who are orphaned. And it's just a completely different genre. I kind of doubt that would happen, actually. But especially interesting to know that horror has, as I saw observed recently, kind of edged into some of the other holidays. You get some Christmas horror movies or Valentine's horror movies, and it's not just a season. It is kind of a flavor to all the seasons. And there is a little truth to that, because the monsters, they do not take 11 months out of the year off and then swarm in only around October. As we'll note in chapter 1, behold the monsters we may see in reality. Now, interesting that we're talking about this kind of as a cap to Monster Month this year, because recently out there in the culture, in the main culture space, we've seen a lot of discussion about whether or how to deplatform a monster. That is a human being who has made a conscious choice to swerve into monstrous ideologies. And you don't even know who I'm talking about because you may be listening to this episode in June of 2026 or later. And by then, hopefully, we put the controversy to rest. My guess is, though, there's recently been one just the past few weeks anyway. And so my anecdote here counts for that. This, however, is part of a larger discussion we're seeing happily, I think, in popular culture about what we're supposed to do about real monsters. Zach and I recently talked about demons in a kind of a two-part miniseries called Fall from Heaven, about what do we do about demons in these stories in which heroines like Freyrin or the K-pop demon hunters are realizing no, demons are actually evil and they need to be destroyed. It's true that intrinsic idea there is from scripture, and there are indeed evil spirits out there in the Christian worldview and in reality that we believe in. Although there are many things that scripture says about them and other things the Bible does not say about them. Others, however, talk about monsters in the form of human beings who do terrible, besetting sins like abuse and manipulations. And in response, we see kind of a bad weapon proposed. Okay, so don't fight the monsters, actually. Lay down your arms. A victim or a bad counselor will advise sympathy for the devil, as it were. Others, in a overreaction to that, will leap straight for the exorcisms or the aggressive countermeasures. Like, well, you need to get the blunderbuss and just blow that demon's head off. And if it happens to be a human being who's deceived from a demon and you couldn't tell the difference, well, collateral damage. Not great. One way or the other, whether it's a Christian who's fooled into picking up the wrong kind of weapon, or a secular person who doesn't really know what evil is and just thinks, well, I'll know it if I see it, I think you're going to have limited success with combating the evil from outside. And so that's why I really want to emphasize in this episode that truth I mentioned earlier, the greatest battle lies within. And that before we can talk about monsters out there, whether it's evil ideas or evil spirits, we must address the problem of our own monstrous hearts. And so, Geoffrey, that's why we always like to lead with a guest when we can, is asking about that personal testimony, not just because it's a Christian podcast, but because we truly believe that the solution to the first and worst monster that we'll ever face is true repentance and faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. But then he does set us on a mission. We only are pietistic to a biblical point. We go on mission then as we are fighting our own sin with that pattern of repentance and faith, even though I do believe that salvation is forever. You're locked in if you persevere. We do have a purpose of fighting back against other monsters, and that will include evil ideas and evil systems sometimes, and Christians will debate about how that works. I just wonder then if you have thoughts about the monsters that you faced, even though you haven't faced that expected aversion to horror and paranormal fiction from the Christians you've met. Like, I know, for example, that there are some critics who are Christians like that and who think, well, we're not really supposed to fight the monsters. You know, just be good, go to church, raise your family, keep it down, stay quiet, or else you might turn into a monster yourself. Do you have any thoughts about how that has worked out in your life or the callings of people you know?
Sure. You know, the objection when it comes up always reminds me of, and I'm not sure if you've ever read this, but the little essay, The Red Angel by Chesterton in his collection, Tremendous Trifles, where it's actually applied to fairy tales. And this is something you'll probably hear me talk a lot about because I think that the line between horror and fairy tale, at least certainly horror as I write it in fairy tale, is pretty porous. So what he describes there is similar. There's a woman in this little essay he writes who objects to children reading fairy tales because it might scare them because there are monsters in them. And he points out, Chesterton observes that the monsters are there. Like, the children will recognize this, and the fear is real because they have this sort of recognition of the world kind of as it is. And the solution is not to pretend like they're not there or not show them, but it's to show them that the monster can be defeated. If you ever read Coraline by Neil Gaiman, there's a misquoting of this passage at the beginning of it, and Neil Gaiman is himself sort of obviously a problematic figure at this point. But as far as an actual book, Coraline is, I think it still holds up pretty well, and I think that the point being made here, and I think he also, as a non-Christian, slightly adapts what Chesterton's getting at. Chesterton wants to point out that there is a role for like knights or heroes or faithful people who will follow Christ and defeat the monsters. And there may be a sense in which that's us, but there's also a sense in which we can read of sort of other figures, heroes of faith that we can see doing that too. So I think that there is value in it. First of all, if we can see the fear and the horror as being embedded in the fallen, sinful world that we live in and needing to be addressed, needing to be faced, but also, not to linger there, not to just first of all, not to accept it, as you were saying, not to just lay down our arms and pretend like there is no problem, or that it will just kind of go away, but also not to fight it on its own terms. Which would be kind of the other sort of potential extreme, but to recognize that virtue and goodness and truth and beauty and most of all the gospel and our holiness through Christ, that can be a combating against that kind of spiritual evil. I think that that is a reality. Now, I also want to, stepping in, recognize first of all that I always I teach a class on fairy tales too, and I often, tell my students that the value of the fairy tale is that we actually can sort of like enter into it from multiple different viewpoints. We tend to think about entering the fairy tale as the hero, like that's who we're supposed to identify with. And I think there can be some value in that we can look at a person fighting evil and, in a fantastic setting. And then we can sort of see virtues from there that then we can live out in our own life. That is a good thing, and I think that's appropriate to a certain extent. But we also have to recognize that we also, in other ways, very really enter into the fairy tale in other ways. Like in some senses, we're also the bride, right? We're the princess who needs to be rescued by the prince, who is there, because there is ultimately one true hero, and that's not us. And we are the bride who needs to be brought out from the captivity of the wicked monster. We also have to recognize that were it not for Christ himself, that we would be the monster in the fairy tale, that is also a role in some senses that we have because we are sinful beings. And that even though we are rescued from that, I think having that recognition that we are not wholly holy yet, that we are still works in progress, and therefore there is sin in us, that we need to be wary of becoming that monster still, again, is also important. And also to recognize that on the human, it is good in the supernatural or spiritual or speculative things sometimes to have just a complete wicked monster as evil to show what the category is, but then also to recognize that when we turn to other human beings, our friends and neighbors and other people around there, that they have sin in them, and so humans can act monstrous in some senses, but that they also have the image of God always in them too. So we can't just treat them like orcs or Dracula by themselves. Like, we have to help, our goal would ultimately, I think, hopefully in part be to help them see that monstrousness, that sin inside themselves, as hopefully we have seen it in ourselves. And some of my stories and poems and fiction, that is one angle that I'm sort of like taking, is to try to push on that side of things. And other times I would be showing more of the redemptive component, the fairy tale-ish component, depending on which angle. But yeah, I think those would be some of the things that I would see. But circling back to myself, just first of all, recognizing, like, making sure I'm not being that monster, that I am not acting, that I am resisting the sinful component that still resides in me on this side of the eschaton, and then turning outward towards shining the light on myself, but then also, where other dark places it may need to be shown.
Right. I think we need both of those elements there, and I'm so glad that you're emphasizing those. I see two extremes as we look out. I see generally among some Christians, and I will not say the church, I don't like doing that, but in some Christians, I see this tendency to claim there are not really monsters out there in the world. They're not that bad. The only monsters we need to worry about are those amongst ourselves in our churches. And I always wonder, wow, what kind of life did you lead that makes you think there's no monsters out there? Like, your neighbors may be confronting monsters out there and you're not noticing. So I don't know you're much help at all. But then the other extreme is, as we've seen, either Christians or cultural conservatives or both, who act like there are no monsters among us whatsoever. We don't need to worry about them. We only need to worry about this monster over there. And that's why I like your book and other stories that remind us the monsters are lurking everywhere. All right. Christ's redemption is real. It is sure. And no, those who are redeemed are no longer totally depraved, but we must still be concerned about that monstrous tendency, even as we are learning to fight back against the monsters out there, which we'll talk about in chapter 2. First, however, our second sponsor is author Vince Mancuso. He was last here with the Jabin Kainos sci-fi series. Now he's switching over to fantasy for this new book. Are you looking for a fantasy your young reader won't want to put down and you'll actually feel good about them reading? In a Fae tale, that's Faie, magical creatures have revealed themselves and claimed the world as their own. Floating cities hang in the skies, Fae lords govern the earth, and one law binds mankind: no human may wield magic. When 12-year-old Isla Cosgrave's outlawed power awakens, she's thrust into a conflict that spans Fae queens, dwarves, and human outcasts, each with secrets of their own. Isla may be the key to uncovering the truth and shaping the future of both worlds. A Fae tale, spelled Faie, by Vince Mancuso, is available now on Amazon. Get more info in this episode's show notes. 287 is this episode, or at lorehaven.com/podcast. We'll also have the link in cool cover for a Fae tale. Chapter 2, How to Fight Back, the Weapons of Saints. And Geoffrey and Zach, my guiding verse here is one that Zach quoted a few episodes ago, Romans 12:21. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. That kind of balances both. It's the Apostle Paul's warning that yes, evil can overcome you, and he doesn't specify where. The evil of Caesar and the world system, or the evil from your own besetting sin, but he says overcome evil with good. This is not the wrong kind of pietism. This is not sitting around waiting for it to happen just because we're so humble. This is proactive. And that proactive battle for us often depends on our unique callings and vocations. And Geoffrey, I didn't realize until I was putting down some notes for this episode how much my heart and mind resonate with this topic in particular, because it goes to an issue that Zach and I will explore in our next episode. How in the world do Christians do cultural engagement? And that's what Christ in Pop Culture does, right? It's like right there, and it's pop culture right there in the title. And that's what I like about that idea. But some battles occur in families and churches. Like, I think some listeners even now will think primarily about the evil they need to overcome in their dysfunctional family or their dysfunctional church or a Christian institution or something. And so preoccupied are they with that battle that they may miss that others are called to move outward. Like, maybe they can't win the battle in those spaces, or maybe they don't have it, or maybe it's been won. And so now, okay, the family's going okay, my church is going okay, I'm going to move outward and engage the wider world, the popular culture, the movies, the music, the politics. Maybe I'm engaging with what's already there, or maybe I'm actually participating in making some stuff. Either way, if we are fighting in these battles with sinful tools, we do risk reversion to monsters. Not that I think people can get unsaved, but you certainly can fall into sinful patterns. And that legacy does haunt many Christians, but I don't think we need to be slaves to that. There can be a sort of God-given confidence as we move forward while still recognizing our limitations. We also don't need to focus solely on the problems amongst ourselves. I have a term I use, church back home syndrome, for those who are so wrapped up in those inner conflicts or those conflicts with other Christians that they either are not able or refuse to engage the monsters that come from other places. And this is where we get to an issue I have with kind of these battles between those who are more on the academic side and those who are more on the, okay, I'm going to go out and make stuff and I'm going to engage the culture side. Each one seems to misunderstand the other or underrate the value of either vocation. Because I think that a great way to do culture engagement, whether it's politics or music, fantastical fiction, whatever, is to rely on the great stories that you are talking about that expose evil and often illustrate biblical ways to defeat these monsters in reality. And Geoffrey, I wonder if you've seen maybe what I see, and maybe you avoid these topics, but it's something that I'm kind of getting into more, this divide between folks who want to, they might say, or others might say about them, win the culture war, and those who fancy literature. And I ask, guys, you need each other. You culture warriors, you need to recognize that, yes, sin can come from within, and you may have spies and saboteurs behind your line in your camp. don't do the whole no enemies within us thing. We're all on the same side. No, sometimes you're not. Sometimes you got spies and monsters lurking there. But you guys need fiction. You guys need literature and these old and wonderful stories. You need reason and imagination. And then I want to turn to the academic sorts and say, you guys need to engage the real world too. You have something of value here for those who fancy themselves culture warriors or engagers. And I think both sides need to learn from each other. And one of my favorite, some of my favorite podcasters or pundits to listen to are those who love literature, who love the good old things, along with talking about their real world applications, because those folks are more likely to recognize that that our weapons are not primarily physical; they are spiritual. And as Paul wrote again in 2 Corinthians 10:4, these weapons have divine power to demolish strongholds, and the strongholds are built by enemies who are not human. So we got this idea of that our true enemies are not flesh and blood, but they are these ideas, often involving actual monsters from the spiritual plane that you just got back from with your portal. So any thoughts about that? Just why even folks who want to engage need this literature as a chief tool, or even you could say spiritual weapon in our arsenal to defeat the monsters?
As you were alluding to, and certainly my own experience, something like our Christ and pop culture, where we've had often people who are in the academic world but wanting to write and come out to a broader type of audience and engage culture more directly. I think that can happen. I do think that there is a value to a scholarly vocation, which can also be doing these things. In fact, actually, I'm teaching a class on literature and the Christian imagination, and only a couple of them are my humanities students, and most of the others are in other majors and stuff, and they're working on doing scholarship, I think, for God's glory. But I would also recognize that by itself is a kind of limited sphere. Like most of those things are not going to make their way out of that relatively small world. And so culture making, actually producing cultural artifacts, I think can be very valuable. Now, I will say also, just because somebody reads or appreciates or studies something doesn't mean that they're automatically going to be the best practitioner or analyst of it in other contexts. So not everybody who reads a lot of things is going to be a writer or a filmmaker who watches film. I think you can do one or the other, but I do appreciate and value, and I've always for myself wanted to kind of occupy both of those spaces, both the analyst side and the approaching of it from an appreciation side, but also recognizing the boldness to kind of that you're describing, I think, to try to come out and discuss or produce artifacts and pieces that can become culture themselves, that display the gospel or the beauty of Christian truth in a variety of different ways. And again, sometimes that might mean taking a look within our house and recognizing the concerns there. And sometimes it may mean recognizing the ways in which other cultural trends are problematic and sinful and wrong outside of the church. And I think that there is a good role for self-reflection sometimes, because I think that sometimes, really often, the best, most astute critics of the church, in a sense, can be ourselves. I think one of the things that I find is that somebody who doesn't really understand another point of view, their criticisms don't actually carry any weight. So I am actually much more willing to listen to a Christian who is describing concerns about the church precisely because they actually get it. They actually understand the value of it, and they want to heal. They want to make things better.
Amen.
As opposed to tearing it down. And so when I do in my own writing, or both my scholarship and also my writing in my fiction or poetry, this is actually in a lot of my poetry too, when I am pushing back at the secular side or people who are non-Christians, agnostics or atheists or skeptics, I'm always trying to go in a sense with a kind of humility, in the sense that I want to recognize the actual questions or positions as they're maintaining them. I have this little sort of fictional persona I call atheist me. Okay, imagine if I didn't actually believe in God. What are the kinds of arguments, or what are the kinds of symbolic or literary or poetic things that would actually make sense to me?
Oh yeah, that's like Steel Manning.
Yep. And that was honestly one reason why, even though I actually am very appreciative for and very thankful for the fact that we have publishers like, Enclave, who published your book, and many others who are operating from an explicitly Christian perspective. For myself, I was really trying to work into a non-Christian publishing environment precisely because I wanted to see, like, can somebody look at my stuff and see and know that I am a Christ follower and that is evident in my work, but that I'm not caricaturing their viewpoints and that I'm writing horror that anybody who loves the genre could recognize the value of it. So at the publisher that I work with, primarily Hippocampus, they're the two guys who kind of run it. One of them is Eastern Orthodox, and then the other, who's the main sort of content editor, who's also one of the top Lovecraft scholars, is a pretty well-known, outspoken atheist. He literally has books with names like God's Defenders, What They Believe and Why They're Wrong, and just finished a 1,000-page history of atheism that he was just writing right now. And he's very aware of where I am coming from. And so, Lord willing, I would love for long-term back and forth with him to have even greater advance of recognizing the beauty and the truth of the gospel. But
all right, doing the Lord's work there. That's fantastic.
Yes. But not trying to hide who I am, but also operate in that space somewhat. So that was the plan.
And this is the unique power of the horror genre. And this is something we've talked about a lot before, in that the horror genre shows real evil in a world where everyone tries to relativize the good and evil. And by showing truly monstrous creatures or, mutated humans or something like that, it forces us to realize there's some much darker forces in the real world than maybe we're comfortable admitting half of the time. And I feel like what horror also does really well is it shows us the foolish ways to fight monsters. We've talked about kind of sympathizing with the devil. And, that's a common trope in a lot of horror movies, oh, the monster is just a victim. Oh, the poor little monster. And then it eats everyone after they bring it inside the house, and there's kind of a whole meme on this, if you're cold, they're cold, bring them inside, right? Because we can get sort of that empathy in those empathy traps. Another common one that I see, and this is really illustrated well in the Fifth Wave series, which is really a YA sci-fi, but there's very much this horror edge to it, and it's about teenagers fighting against alien invaders, and what these aliens do in this, and this is kind of a spoiler, but after they cause these global catastrophes, they essentially, it's like body snatchers, where they take over certain humans, or they have these kind of hybrid humans, and what they do through that is to get humans to suspect and fight one another. Because there's not many humans left at that point. And they're all right, we just need to get them all to kill each other, and then we'll basically rule the planet. This is a real life type of warfare, like a dialectical warfare that's used very often on large scales. There's a KGB defector named Yuri Bezmenov that has talked about this, and how the KGB tried to plant all these different seeds in our culture to try to pit everyone against each other. And I think it definitely still happens today. And so by looking at these stories and how people don't really understand how these monsters are working and trying to trick them or just devour them, and then you see these characters who, there's this whole other trope of well, maybe the monster has a point, maybe humans are really the monsters, and then they switch sides only to then have a horrible ending there as well. So I think these films are very stark, obviously, and they deal with these sort of darker situations, but I think it reveals things about human nature that we're not always comfortable addressing, or at least from a very secular point of view, doesn't really have a good framework for it. And it shows that the Christian worldview does have the right framework for understanding this.
Yeah, I think that there's some really good value to that, and I appreciate many of those kinds of the kind of horror where we're recognizing there is an evil sort of an evil that exists or that is manifest, that is supernatural and that we, encounter to our peril, but have to recognize it. I was listening to y'all's episode on demons, and appreciating a lot of the points that you were sort of making there. And so that is, I think, a key aspect to looking at those things. I think there's also can be some value in using the monsters to kind of like recognize the ways in which humans can respond in kind of problematic ways to them. Part of that would be, again, sort of like not being able to see an evil for what it is, and then trying to, like you said, sympathize with it or empathize with it, sort of like beyond, like in ways that become destructive. I do think there can be a lot of horror in which you might sort of say that the monster may reflect nonetheless something that is really sort of like problematic, but then the way the humans sort of take it up is also bad. So I would say if you look at the original Frankenstein, for example, I'm thinking about this now, I haven't seen Del Toro's version, but that just came out or is coming out. But like from what I've heard, it's sort of along these lines where in Mary Shelley's version, like in some senses, the monster kind of does have a point, because Victor Frankenstein, who has tried to sort of like make a person without a woman, just kind of construct this creature without any idea of like what would become of it when he creates it. Like that is a reflection on Frankenstein. Like he is not really doing something good in doing that. It does not, however, justify the monster's actions. And I don't think Shelley intends us to have so much sympathy for the monster that we're like, oh, it was fine that you just killed all of Frankenstein's, family and friends. Like where it sounds like Del Toro might be actually kind of moving in that direction from what I've heard of the film. I'm not sure. Del Toro tends to, I like him as a filmmaker in some ways, but he does tend to sort of have a lot of that sympathy for the monster kind of thing. I think that we can sort of like have something revealed to us in monstrous ways that we may need to wrestle with, but that's different from saying that we just like accept the creature, the monster, or the entity and just be okay with that. I think that can be both in some senses. Sometimes we might want a story where we have good people who are battling evil. And I think that, again, like I said before, I think there's a role for that. I think that can be very good. But I think that there can also be a good story where there is an evil that does reveal wrong or evil things in humans as well. It reveals problematic aspects of ourselves, sinful aspects of ourselves too. You guys were referencing how in the demon one, how one of the characteristics oftentimes, from what I understand in real actual demonizations and also often in fiction, is the demons being able to know secret sins or issues in the lives of the people who they're dealing with. That doesn't make the demon empathetic or some of the we're supposed to identify with. But then it also does show the challenges of being flawed humans when we enter into that kind of spiritual combat too.
Yeah, I won't give any spoilers for the final season of My Hero Academia, but there's a wonderful turn to the story where the hero, Izuku Midoriya, is engaged in what seems to be the final boss battle of the entire series. So I really need to avoid spoilers here. But suffice it to say, this certainly is a monstrous foe who is behaving more and more like a demon. And yet there is a glimpse of the human that he used to be. And our hero, because he himself benefited so much from the support of his mentors and grown-ups and other superheroes he looked up to, is determined to reach that human within. And so he does sympathize, but what does he do then? Does he just try to use his words? No, he's going to use every single power in the set in order to beat this villain into submission and recover any humanity that's left. And I don't know what's going to happen. I haven't read the manga. We'll have to continue and see. But that's what I love about the idea of, okay, if you're going to sympathize with the monster, it's not going to make you afraid to confront the monster. No, it's going to embolden you to hold on to humanity, confront the monster, and recover any humanity that monster has lost. But maybe that monster is beyond redemption, and in which case God's going to have to handle that, and fortunately he will, because vengeance is the Lord's. Let's move to chapter 3 in a moment, talking more specifically about Geoffrey's new book. First, let's talk about my previous book, because I'm sponsor 3, and I won't reread the description for Above the Circle of Earth, but suffice it to say, it is about Brock and Alicia Rivers, who return from exile on Mars by the secular state in order to resist the secular state and combat their monstrous policies by forming the first missionary outreach above the circle of Earth, but they'll also confront some monsters lurking within their own people. That's the quick summary, but I do want you, faithful listener, to go, if you can, to estephenburnett.com and sign up for updates there. It's right there on the front page, estephenburnett.com. You can also check the box for my updates when you sign up free at lorehaven.com. And then watch for updates in your inbox, because I'm going to have some updates this month, including, Lord willing, a official author store at my website that I've been working on. If I can get it to work, we'll have that put together for some special gift items that you can order just in time for Christmas gift giving at estephenburnett.com for Above the Circle of Earth and exclusive space mission merch. Chapter 3, gonna have to speed run this one, Defeating the Monsters of the Lime Kiln. Now, Geoffrey, we last had you on here to explore Stoker's Dracula, the aforementioned classic, which brilliantly explores a monster of many potential elements, the suave seducer, the toxic male predator, and the foreign conqueror, among other fears. But your new book, The Lime Kiln and Other Enchanted Spaces, collects weird stories and poems that feature various spooks like ghosts, a killer robot, a vampire, and other unpleasant beasties. All of them at once, I suppose. There's a reason why these creatures persist, not just in the popular imagination, but also as analogs for real world struggles and fears that people have. We find evil lurking in surprising places that challenge our assumptions. We also find surprising saints who survive or defeat the evils. So it's perfect to bring you on here then just in time for the recently concluded All Saints Day, because we're celebrating not the monsters, but the saints who defeat them necessarily. I'm just curious why you decided, okay, I'm going to do a collection of all of these things about all these different types of monsters. Like, do you have any favorites, or were there any particular challenges in researching how these spooks have appeared in previous stories and how you could repurpose them for your particular emphasis?
They're like my children. I'm not supposed to have favorites, but I do. I do particularly. I like the title one, The Lime Kiln. I liked the character. Those are a couple of my sort of probably more virtuous characters, I would say, and ones who I resonated with. In fact, I spent a few weeks like not feeling like writing again after I finished it, because I was like sad to leave those characters behind. And so I did appreciate writing that one. That was a lot of fun. It was one to be done. When I finished with it, I was like, oh, I feel like I wrote something pretty good here. And then similarly, I have a similar experience with the characters in the last story, The Cartographer, which I'm hoping will be the launch off to like a whole set of stories about those characters and their world too. That's kind of an unusual story in the sense that it's kind of horror / dark fantasy, but also a kind of little meet cute rom-com type of thing too. So it's got a little bit of everything going on in it. And I think I like researching things, and I like to imagine people who are not me. So I don't really write a lot of really autobiographical characters. There will be little bits and pieces of me. And there's a lot of like kind of intellectually or philosophically autobiographical characters who will say things theologically or philosophically that are similar to what I believe in some ways, but they'll usually have gotten to it a very different way. So I end up having to do a lot of research on almost every story, because I have to imagine what's it like to be X person who is not Geoffrey Reiter. Entering into other people's experience to me is fun that way. I think one of the things that I wanted to balance out here in the human element was to push back against something I had seen in myself as a very young writer. When I was a teenager in early 20s, I recognized eventually that I had this almost like sadistic relationship to my characters, where my stories were often very violent and my characters died in some pretty significant ways, in ways that sound almost like slasher-like now, which is not my favorite horror subgenre. Where it's almost like you're rooting for the creativity of the kills or whatever. You often see this in reviews of slasher movies, where they'll kind of like give it high marks because of how people died in gruesome ways. And what I wanted to do was, like, if anything ever happened to any human character, like, I wanted you to feel it like a real death, like you should, or pain, like even if they were the villains who maybe had their fate coming. And I try to have there be a moral world to each of my stories when something happens, but nonetheless, there should be some sense of loss or mourning of a human's life that has been taken. even if those were very flawed humans. And yeah, I use the different types of monsters and stuff as kind of ways of revealing my characters and what they really value. I have one demon, for example, but even that one, I wasn't really going for that's in Big Sky. And the demon in that one isn't really like, I think you would really actually encounter with like, if you were an actual exorcist or something. It's that one's admittedly a little bit more speculative, but I wanted to see what happens oftentimes when we as secular human beings who inhabit a world that we think of as being operating according to natural laws, like when we encounter something enchanted that can't be explained on those terms of raw realism even as Christians, as we often think about it. I think that can just sort of like push Christian and non-Christian characters alike to kind of the edge of like, what do we actually believe, and what, because I would probably, if I encountered something like every character in all the horror movies, right? You're like, what? Don't you get it? You're in a monster movie. Well, of course they don't. None of us would. We would probably do just as stupid things as they would, because like none of us expect to be in that kind of environment. And so I wanted to play with that, but at least the Christian characters have a worldview that in principle can accommodate that in a way that my non-Christian characters tend not to have.
Oh, if we ended up in a real life horror story, we would be the last to know, Geoffrey, because we have this divide in our heads sometimes between the fiction that we enjoy and the real world. But the best kinds of stories remind us that, yes, the monsters can come from anywhere, and these are not just imaginations. They are symbols of very true realities. That's the Lime Kiln and Other Enchanted Spaces. Geoffrey, where can folks find this fine work for purchase? And it can be read during non-spooky seasons as well. And then where can folks follow your work on the interwebs?
I mean, in principle, Amazon.com, they've been a bit finicky recently with it. So I can't always guarantee that there will be a new copy up for print. Now, it is still, I think, as of right now, you can get the Kindle version. And I think there might be some of the like through the Amazon store that you can purchase them. Hopefully it will get back up and for regular purchase again soon. If you go to Barnes & Noble, it's still there. And if you have like a membership, it would actually be cheaper for you anyway to get it at Barnes & Noble than Amazon. You can get it directly from the publisher, Hippocampus Press, and their website. I also, because I was a speaker once for the Eighth Day Institute out in Wichita, Kansas, Eighth Day Books, you can get it through there as well, I think, too.
And of course, listeners, you can find Geoffrey at christandpopculture.com. Other URLs may be pending. Geoffrey, you're not going back into that abysmal dimension, are you? You're going to stay with your family a little bit, enjoy some wholesome preparation for the holidays, right?
I will absolutely be doing that for sure.
Great. Well, get ready for the next monster fight, because until our king comes back, we still got some battles ahead of us. So thanks for gracing us with your wisdom, and we'll look forward to having you back again sometime. Geoffrey Reiter, everybody.
Well, Stephen, this discussion and bringing up George MacDonald reminded me of this quote from C.S. Lewis about how George MacDonald's works made an impact on him before he was a Christian. And, MacDonald very much had these fairy tales with kind of a darker edge to them, like we've been talking about. And Lewis says at the time that he discovered MacDonald, he says, quote, "I've been waist deep in romanticism and likely enough at any moment to flounder into its darker and more evil forms, slithering down the steep descent that leads from the love of strangeness to that of eccentricity, and thence to that of perversity." So you go from I like strange things to I'm eccentric to now it's just really just perversion and darkness. And I think that is always a danger with these stories. But, the best stories remind us that monsters are evil and we have to fight them. And there are real monsters in the real world. So to you, our listener, we want to know, what are some real monsters that you have met, survived, and even defeated? Is this a metaphorical monster, or do you have some kind of paranormal story? We're always listening for interesting stories. So send us a note to podcast@lorehaven.com or find us on Facebook, Instagram, or X.
Next on Fantastical Truth, we still believe in cultural engagement. That's the Christian mission, to share our faith in the real world, seeking to win souls to Jesus. And these individuals naturally are going to seek biblical influence in stories and songs and beyond. So why do some believers maybe think they want cultural engagement, but then when we're faced with angry or manipulative anti-Christian critics who engage us right back, we kind of retreat and surrender and throw up our hands and call for pietistic separation all of a sudden? I'm noticing this tendency, and so I thought, well, let's talk about it in our next episode. We believe in engaging the monsters, but that calls for discernment, doesn't it? Because some demons are actually humans who still need to be redeemed, and then some demons disguise themselves as humans and call for our sympathy. So let us look to Scripture, not to the culture wars and not to other information sources, for our wisdom as we seek to engage and defeat the worst kinds of monsters and continue to seek and find Christ's fantastical truth.